So, good day, friends. This is Dr. Bob Hamilton, and you have tuned in today to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Thank you for making us part of your day. You're busy people. I appreciate that. The fact that you're here and listening makes me happy. If you like what you hear, pass it on to other people, other friends, family. We're trying to build an audience. The reason is because I bring good people in front of you on a weekly basis. And today is a pleasure to introduce a very special individual. He's someone that I knew many years ago when he was a young graduate from SC. His name is Sanjay Merchant. I should say Dr. Sanjay Merchant. He's now got a PhD in theology, philosophy of religion, actually. And Sanjay is now a professor, a full professor of theology back at Moody Bible Institute, which is in Chicago. And he's a graduate from SC, USC in computer engineering, went on to Claremont Institute out there in Pomona area and got a PhD in the philosophy of religion. So Sanjay Merchant, is such a pleasure to have you today on the Hamilton Review.
Thanks for having me.
It's so good to see you after many years. I guess we ran into each other for a short time in Santa Monica when you were just a pup. Recently graduated, and now you've got 4 kids, and your life has moved in a wonderful way. So Sanjay, what I'd like to have people do who come on my show is I like to have them kind of introduce themselves. There's a reason why you're doing what you're doing today. You can start wherever you want to start in the past, but what was that course that happened in your life that kind of moved you in terms of the things that caused you to want to, first of all, want to get a degree in computer engineering, I guess, and then next to get a PhD in the philosophy of religion later on. So, Sanjay, I'm going to turn the microphone over to you, and you're on.
Yeah, I grew up in Orange County, so I'm a Southern Californian, and I grew up in a very secular home. My father is an immigrant from India. My mother was actually a Midwestern girl, and so their religious backgrounds were Hindu and Catholic, respectively, and our home was very secular. Um, my father, being an Indian immigrant, it's very common for Indian immigrants to encourage their children to study engineering and pre-law. Those sorts of things are very much respected in the Indian community. So that's what I studied at USC. I stayed in Southern California for my degree, and I met my future wife there. Her name's Erin, and we met there and married right after college. During my time in college, I became a believer. It was a really powerful event that happened, series of events with a number of friends there. And so I was a young Christian at the time, newly married, and my wife and I were thinking about what it is we wanted to do with our lives, um, other than have a family. I had a sense that God had a calling, and perhaps an academic calling, because of the interest that I had in important questions. And computer engineering satisfied that to some degree, but I really wanted to think about the things of God, study the Bible. And so my wife encouraged me in that. We met you around that time, around 1997. And between 1997 and 2000, we attended the same church. So we knew you a bit. And in that time, our first daughter was born. She's now a graduate of USC herself. She's 22
Oh,
years old.
well,
And, yeah, she was born at that time. And um, my wife and I prayed and talked about these things at length, and decided to go on to Talbot School of Theology there, also in Southern California. And I studied there for a while, and that's when we moved on from Lighthouse Church. And I did my seminary studies, um, and then through that, I really realized my calling to academic ministry and teaching was confirmed, and my wife continued to encourage me in that. So we went on to Claremont Graduate University to do the PhD in philosophy of religion, and that brought together all of my studies at Talbot. I did both philosophy and theology at Talbot, and I was able to think about and write on the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, which still amazes me, and it's something I love teaching. And so after that, position opened up at Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, which is a school that I knew very well. it's a school that's well known in certain evangelical circles, and it's a place for ministry preparation. So when I saw a position open up there, I couldn't wait to apply, and I was very blessed that they hired me, and so I've been at Moody for the last decade.
Well, amazing. And so Erin, was Erin, when you met her and married her at married shortly after your graduation from USC, was she would you call her a Christian at that point in time? Was she?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. She was raised in a believing home, and she herself developed her own faith very early on in life. And when I met her at USC, we actually met at a Bible study, and I was a baby Christian, and she was a very young believer, but had a bit more of a mature faith by that point.
Yeah. Can you just because everyone who's listening today is not necessarily, maybe understanding of the language you're talking about. So when you say that you grew up in a secular home, and then you came to this, you had this epiphany, or you had this moment where you really began, you said, look, I am committing myself to the Christian faith, to Christ in particular. Tell us a little about that, because I think this is important, that some people don't, just like, whatever, they don't get that. But this was a moment in your life, that, and I will tell you that I had a similar moment in my life, a little bit younger than you, but tell us a little bit about that event in itself, if you would, if you feel comfortable talking about that.
Of course, of course. By secular, I mean not an atheist per se, perhaps not even an agnostic. Many secular people are churchgoers or committed to other religious faiths, at least nominally. Secular, I take it to mean that God is perhaps there, perhaps not there, but more or less irrelevant to the way I live my life. And the American culture, we could say, is secular in that sense.
Yeah.
Um, it's pretty much expected that we go about our lives without much reference to God. And if we do make reference to God, it's sort of an addendum to what we're already doing. Whereas the Christian life is quite different. In the Christian life, Jesus Christ is the center of everything. And when Christians say Jesus is Lord, what we mean is that he really is Lord over my thoughts, my choices, my attitudes, my what I do with my body, what I do with my time, what I do with my relationships. And Christian discipleship is a life of learning what that means. And so Christians come off as culturally weird in many ways, especially in a secular society. And I learn that more and more. But what it takes to take on that attitude and receive that faith, as I understand it, it takes a movement of God in our lives, something that I didn't necessarily expect to happen, something that I didn't necessarily ask for. But there came a moment where I met some Christians at the University of Southern California, and at the time I was a pretty ardent skeptic. I was interested in talking to them. Most secular people are not interested in talking about such things, I think, and maybe ignoring at best and going about the things that we go about in our lives. I was interested in engaging because I was a pretty ardent skeptic and wanted to fight about these things. And through the course of discussing these things with sincere Christians, the Holy Spirit changed my heart. I remember this moment where some friends asked to pray for me, and I normally would have said no to that. Instead of saying no, I said yes. And I really did feel a change in my attitude, in my perspective on who Jesus was. And they encouraged me after that prayer to read the Gospel of John, which is one of the four New Testament accounts of the life of Jesus. And so I read the Gospel of John, and I was really undone. I mean, it was very emotional. And it's not to say that the Christian life is primarily emotional. It does involve emotions like anything else. But this moment for me was very emotional. And I felt as if I really encountered the risen Jesus Christ. And so that was transformative for me. The next morning, I woke up and I realized, I didn't decide, I realized that I was a Christian
Yeah.
because I believed what the Gospel of John said. And I was as shocked as anybody that
Yeah.
I believed what the Gospel said. I didn't want to believe what it said. I didn't expect to believe what it said, but I found that I did. And that was in many ways very troubling in my life. I now had a new set of values that I didn't have before. I now had a new perspective on my own behavior. Um, Things that we do that we know are wrong. Um, in Christian theology, most people know we call that sin. The things that are offensive to God. I didn't know that it was offensive to God. I didn't even know God. And I felt before I was a Christian some sense of regret and sometimes embarrassment over the things that I knew that were wrong, but I never really grieved. And I
Yeah.
certainly never repented. That is, turned to God, asked forgiveness, and asked God to help me live in a different way. And so I learned what that was. And so for me, that was really the foundation of a new life and a new direction, moving away from computer engineering to the study of theology.
Yeah. So I have a question. So your father was a Hindu, or he grew up in a Hindu tradition, um, and your mother was Catholic. And how did your parents look upon this? And I would call this is really kind of that experience when people talk about the born again experience, because this is what you're really experiencing, what you're describing here. How did they take that? Were they happy for you, or did they kind of put pressure on you to say, "Come on, Sanjay, get your life together. This is insanity." How did they approach that?
Yeah, they were very suspicious. They thought it was very odd that I had a new set of values. They were sure that somebody had cast some sort of spell over my mind and that there was somebody in the background that was, for some reason or another, had some sort of influence on me.
Yeah,
And there was no person. There was definitely a church that I began attending, and people that I started to come into friendship and Christian, the Christian life we say communion with, and others on campus at USC. But there was no individual who had any peculiar influence over me or anything like that. They couldn't believe that. They were sure of that because they saw this immediate change in me, change in values, and they were actually encouraging me to go out and do regular college student things. Go date, go have fun, go drink a bit, be normal. It's very odd that you want to go to church and you want to go to Bible study on Friday nights. Most other kids your age aren't doing that. I didn't want to. No interest in doing those things.
so
And again,
but they had to look at some of your behaviors as being a positive thing. I mean, did they acknowledge that? And I guess I would say, maybe bring it up to today's date. Have they over the years looked at your life and said, "Wow, okay, Sanjay, you have changed in a positive way," or are they still skeptics?
yeah, no, absolutely. At first, they were highly skeptical, encouraging me to return to sort of normal, secular way of life. And for my mother, it took months for her to turn around and realize this is actually wonderful what's happened, and I love the son that I have. She actually became a believer after that, and then it took my father about a year, and and then he admitted the same thing to me. He said, "At first, I thought you were in a cult. I thought that something had happened, but I realize now the way that it's affected you and changed you. I'm actually really proud of who you are," which was wonderful to hear. And about 2 years after my conversion, he also became a believer, as did my younger
Hmm.
sister.
Wow. So this was real. This was a real transformation. And I ask that question because I think that sometimes people think that growing up in a Christian home, you just kind of are Christian. As someone who grew up in a Christian home, I know it's very different. There's a point in your life where you have to have that reckoning, if you will, with the Lord, and you have to say, okay, this is going to be me. I'm going to accept not only the theology, I guess, but you're also going to it becomes a personal thing that you yourself endeavor to pursue Christ and Christianity, and what that means. And I think it is we talk about the walk with Christ, and I have to say that it is really that. It isn't like you um, necessarily get it all from in the very beginning. We all know that, but there is a point of inception. It isn't like you just you are a Christian because your grandmother and your grandfather, and this is what we do, and this is how. I think there is a point where you have to actually receive Christ in a very personal way, and that is obviously what happened to you. So I'm curious. You are now a professor of theology at the Moody Bible Institute. You are looking at the world, and you are thinking, okay, if you're like many people out there, you don't have to be a Christian to think these thoughts, but there is a certain insanity going on in the world today, kind of calling dark things light and light dark. And I'm curious to know what you're thinking and maybe what the thinking is among your colleagues, the professors back there at Moody, in terms of the culture that we see happening within the United States today. So your thoughts on that?
Well, one way to think about that, and there's any number of things that we might consider when you say there's been something of a reversal in the traditional, long-standing, many people would say commonsensical views of right and wrong, and calling traditionally and obviously wrong things right and right things wrong. One way to think about that reversal would be, say, in questions of gender and sexual identity, where people identify in ways that entirely spring out of their will. Uh, I could, of course, identify as a female. We're all aware of that, or rather, identify as a woman, I should say. Identify as a woman, although in terms of sex, I'm a male. And so the transsexual movement says your gender doesn't have to match your sex. You can be transsexual. And where do ideas like that come from? 20 years ago, I think that still would have been scoffed at to some degree. 30 years ago, it would have provoked laughter among people across political spectrums. I'm not saying that we should laugh about some things, but I'm just saying I think that would have been the attitude, and it would have been unthinkable. I think as we go back through the decades, and things have changed pretty rapidly. And to say that you know what, your gender, man or woman, actually matches your sex, male or female, and that's the way it's supposed to be. And to flip those is actually an indication that something, perhaps there's a mental problem or something of that nature. That is actually now considered, as we know, oppressive, at best arrogant, at worst abusive. And this is the way that things are thought about now. And I tell my students about this. I teach an introduction to philosophy course where we start in ancient Greece and we get to what's called modern philosophy, which isn't necessarily today, not necessarily the 21st century, but around the beginning to the middle of the 20th century. And it's a long journey to take, but you can see how ideas unfold in Western thinking. And they've unfolded in such a way that we no longer think that we are intrinsically something. In the ancient world, philosophers and then Christian theologians in the early church all agreed that we are intrinsically, inherently something. And we find ourselves being that thing. So, as humans, we are intrinsically, inherently human. And what kind of human are you? Well, our biology is an indication that you are either a man or a woman. And that's what you intrinsically are. And then we ask further questions about what it is to relate men to women. That's a really important question because only men and women can produce children. And it's vital that men and women produce children because that is what we are as humans, and we produce new humans. So the male, or rather the man-woman relationship is a vitally important one, actually more important than other relationships that are very important. Friendships are important and business relationships are important, but marriage is the most important of all social relationships. And so that's all grounded in this view that we are intrinsically or inherently something. Well, that's sort of devolved over the centuries, as we know, and I can actually trace some of the philosophical ideas that led to today. But
So what are, Sanjay, just because you go from the Greeks all the way to the mid 20th century, what are some of those inflection points?
in the ancient world, and Christian theologians agreed with this, we are essentially something that's called essentialism. So a philosopher like Aristotle would look at you and me and say, men, men, and might look at our wives and say, well, women. Now, how do you know that you're looking at a man or a woman? Well, there is something, um, we, of course, encounter other physical beings through the sense experiences, but we philosophically intuit or perceive something deeper, an essence. When you look at a horse, you say horse, right? Uh, and humanness, horseness are deep metaphysical truths. And we sort of philosophically perceive these things, and it's thought that we actually have these essences. It's a little bit of an exotic idea. I mean, the ancients would have thought that you and I, Dr. Bob, we actually share something. You are one physical being, and I'm a separate physical being. And so we're separate things, but we actually share this essence called humanness. It's
Yeah.
as if there's some sort of invisible reality that flows between us. Sounds a little unscientific today. It sounds a little exotic, but that's what they thought, and they thought it for good reasons, and it actually explains some things. Well, that's sort of evolved or devolved rather, and the idea that you are essentially something and I'm essentially something went from being something that's in you, in me, to being something that's in our thinking or perception. So in the modern period, I perceive you as a man, and it's something that's in my perception. It's not something intrinsically in you. And then through the modern period, it went from being in me to being in my thoughts to being merely in my language. And so we go from essentialism to conceptualism, that is to say, you are a man in my thinking or conceiving, to nominalism, to say that you're only a man in my language. And so I say Dr. Bob, and I am on his podcast. And so I use the masculine pronoun to refer to you, and I use your name and that sort of thing. But that's merely linguistic. Well, that takes us to where we are today. That's why pronouns are so important for some people, because that is actually thought to determine the reality. If you, Dr. Bob, say, you must now refer to me as she, that is my pronoun. Well, me referring to you as she in the modern way of thinking makes it a reality. In the ancient way of thinking, it doesn't change anything.
Yeah.
Language only maps to what really is. We've sort of reversed that. Language is what really is, and reality is supposed to follow suit, which I think is very not less than commonsensical.
No, I think that we're being forced to engage in a little bit of the psychopathology of certain individuals, and when they are determining, what what we have to maybe consider reality, and I think that I always tell people that there are people who have mental derangements, and they have things that they say, like, there's a spider on the wall is my usual example, and there's clearly not a spider on the wall, and yet and what I do when people say there's a spider on the wall and they're having a psychiatric psychotic break, I suppose, I walk over the wall and say, listen, look at this. Here's the truth. Here's the reality. I'm touching the wall. I'm touching where you think there's a spider. There's no spider. Okay. And so I always think that it's important that when you're dealing with mental illness to actually speak truth, always speak truth. That is not being allowed in today's culture. This whole transgenderism, of course, is beginning. They're demanding and offended if you don't engage that thing in their brain, which is happening. Now, listen, my heart goes out to people who are confused in this regard, but I also think that it's very their demands, I think, are sometimes they're putting people in a position where they're having to essentially go beyond what reality is, and so that I find that to be equally offensive. So listen, we're going to take a minute break here, Sanjay. I'm going to come right back to you, but I want to talk. I have a couple of very important questions for you dealing with this whole subtitle of mine, which is Where Kids and Culture Collide. So we're going to get back to that, where kids and culture collide, in 1 second. Friends, you're listening to the Hamilton Review. We're having a great conversation with Sanjay Merchant, Dr. Sanjay Merchant. He's a professor of theology at Moody Bible Institute in Chicago. We'll be right back.
The Hamilton Review podcast is brought to you by Hamilton Babies, 9 kid-friendly products designed for the little loves in your life. Find them at hamiltonbabies.com or amazon.com. Also consider Dr. Hamilton's recently published book, 7 Secrets of the Newborn, available at Barnes & Noble, your local independent bookstore, and amazon.com.
So friends, welcome back to the Hamilton Review. We're having a conversation today with Dr. Sanjay Merchant. He's a professor of theology at Moody Bible Institute. Sanjay, I have a question for you regarding my subtitle of this podcast is called Where Kids and Culture Collide. We're talking about religion. We're talking about our faith in Christ. We're talking about the woke culture that we're dealing with. I am curious. You're a professor back there, and I'm curious what kind of recommendations you have. You're raising kids, young kids, teenagers, preteens, who are very much being baptized, if you will, into this new world that we're living in. What are some recommendations in terms that you would give to families, parents about how do you navigate these times?
I guess the first sage piece of advice is do not fear having conversations with your children about these things. Do not fear that you don't know the right answers, that you might fumble some answers. It, and in fact, I do mean have a conversation and be willing to do that with your children of all ages. Um, Speak to them truth, speak to them clearly and lovingly, but also allow them to speak. This is something that my wife and I have practiced with our kids. And I like to ask them questions about what they think about these things. I might hear that from one sibling, um, did you know that Grace saw this on TikTok and this person was saying this? And I have no qualms about asking her, um, what is it that you saw? What do you think about that? Get her thoughts and allow her to speak and allow her to feel comfortable expressing her ideas, whether they're ill formed or well formed, and have a conversation about it. And I've noticed that my children really appreciate that. They do appreciate that. I hope and I think that they don't feel as if they're lectured to, but they're not coddled either, and they're not allowed to just simply figure out these things on their own. My wife and I have the advantage of years and life in Christ, and also I have the great blessing of having studied some of these things formally, which gives me an advantage. Um, and so they know that we have a clear perspective on things, but without being preached to, without being condemned, they're allowed to think through things and ask questions. We have no fear that the gospel in any way will fail to answer those questions. So we're willing to work with them to get to those answers.
Yeah.
And, sorry, not Socrates, uh, Solomon, the great king of Israel, and he wrote so many of the proverbs. Would encourage that if we lead our children in the way that they should go when they're grown, they will not depart from these truths. And that's not a sort of 100% sort of uh, inviolable promise, but it is a sort of ceteris paribus, sort of all things being equal. If we do this, we can expect that it will bear fruit. And
Yeah.
in my children's lives, I've seen the ups and the downs. When my oldest daughter went to USC, she was thrown into a new social and political and religious and non-religious environment. Not that she was sheltered; she was by no means sheltered, but she got in this new environment. And many people who go to college go through this sort of experience, and really sort of threw her for a loop. And we had many conversations over the last few years where I'm glad that she was able to be exposed to certain ideas and even certain ways of life that were somewhat foreign to her and think through them and live through them. And she's come around to see that the gospel really answers these things. But it was a time of difficulty for her. And as her father, I was happy to go through that with her. I'm just glad the lines of communication were always open.
Yeah. Such an important thing to be able to talk to your children, and some things are uncomfortable to talk about. And I think that you're the sage advice to just to be able to make sure that you are willing to engage a conversation. I think if people try to push it away, or what do you think about? I mean, listen, I think that there are things that are inappropriate for kids. I certainly, during when my children were younger, we shielded them from certain influences. What is your thought about, kind of running interference on the culture and shielding your kids from certain influences?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's negligent not to do so. And some of this might be on a case by case basis, and some families might have different boundaries or lines. I think that those can be legitimate. Um, but nobody, no parent who cares about their children has no boundaries and no lines and permits anything. Being entirely permissive, and knowing that now children have access to uh, all communication and all information and all sorts of things that are beautiful and edifying and ugly and pornographic, all in their pocket, right? All on their phone. It would be negligent for loving parents to not have some boundaries, talk about those boundaries, and protect them. And children, of course, often will fight back about that and say, "Well, my friend, he's allowed to do that. He's allowed to watch this. He's allowed." And so we don't want to be excessively prudish about it either.
Yeah.
We want to allow them to explore, but safely. Loving parents will allow their children to ride a bike without training wheels, knowing that they'll fall off the bike likely and skin their knee. I think socially we can allow that, but loving parents don't allow their children to play in the backyard with shotguns, right? There are clear boundaries. And
Yeah.
so things that are pornographic, um, things that, for example, when under the influence of some individual who wants to sexualize them or wants to encourage sexual exploration at a period in their life where they're far too young to be manipulated by these things. There are such predators, and we need to be aware of them and vigilant.
Absolutely. Any thoughts about when kids should get a cell phone, or should they even get a cell phone? A lot of my friends are saying no, they don't give a cell phone, they give a flip phone, which is limited in terms of what they can actually access via the web. Any thoughts about that?
That's actually fairly wise. I, I don't myself have a rule about that. We waited till our children were teenagers and needed to be in contact with them as they had a little bit more freedom. And I want to be able to know where they are. So I have a 16-year-old boy who has a lot of freedom now that he's a driver to go see his friends at night. And he's a good kid, and he does what he needs to do in terms of school and has his priorities right. But I like to look on my phone and see where he is, and so for me that's very valuable. And I guess families can decide, but I am totally open to experts in areas of child psychology, and other related fields that say, hey, this is what's best. And I myself am open to learn about those things.
Yeah. I've certainly talked to a lot of people about this, and I think that the general feeling is that they need to, giving a 8, 9, 10-year-old kid a cell phone, which with all the capacity to go surfing on the web. Whoa, and even teenagers to a degree, you have to. They're still forming. They're still maturing, and they're subject to some. They can get into some pretty nasty places, and we all know that. Um, I also have a thought about, one of the things that we did is certainly as parents, and this is related, is we kept our kids engaged in activities, their, sporting things, other things, music. Your thoughts? I think that was a good thing in the lives of our children. Not overly busy, because that can also be a burden, but just keeping them engaged in things. So not that we're trying to steal all their free time, but so there is a tendency when you have a lot of free time to your mind can wander into different places. Your thoughts about that?
Yeah, absolutely. We didn't necessarily have ulterior motives in doing this, but I myself, I love the sport of lacrosse. I played it in high school. I played the club team at University of Southern California, and so I introduced it to my sons. And wanted my daughters to play too, but they weren't as interested. But my sons love the sport, and so that was their major identity, or is still their major identity. My older son is a college lacrosse player, and my younger son is a high school player, and that really is their identity. And the conversation that I have with my boys, now it's a little bit different with my daughters. Their interests are more artistic, um, and in terms of the video editing and things like this, they like the technology, and so I've encouraged that. But lacrosse is something that I know with my boys, and I've had many conversations with them about. I've coached them for years, and why we do this, why we play, um, why do we act as if it's important? Why are we excited for wins and so despondent about losses and things like that?
Yeah.
It is important. It matters in this sense. Everything that we do is something that we're offering to God as an act of worship. And so every shot that you take, every ground ball that you pick up, do it to the glory of God. Do it for Jesus. Don't do it for the crowd, right? Don't do it for me, and don't merely do it for yourself. It is important that I'm proud of you. It is important that you feel confidence and pride in yourself. But I tell them that one day, every video of this game, let's say you play a great game and everyone's in awe of how well you played, every video will disintegrate, every memory will fade, except for one. God will remember forever and know forever what we did here today. And so the only real reason to do these things is that we're doing it for the glory of God. And this is an act of worship. And I've seen in their lives, it's a way that God has really taught them discipline, really taught them to grow, really formed them into men. And so it's really a holy activity. It's that they've engaged in, and I'm really proud of them, and I've seen how it's grown them. But that's the way we've approached it.
Yeah. I think that concept of is kind of odd to kind of think about. Okay, you're making the game of lacrosse a holy event. That may sound foreign or kind of weird to some people, but I do think that in everything we do, I think that as we journey through life, we have a tendency to segregate and to put into cubicles. On Sunday we go to church, or Saturday you go to synagogue, and every other time of the week is just like yours to do what you want to do. But I think that is really not necessarily even a Hebraic idea. The idea that we live lives that are in front of the Lord as being lives which are holy. And it sounds almost, kind of hyper spiritual. But I do think that by inculcating that concept into your kids, you've done a good thing, Sanjay. And it is a powerful, if your kids actually embrace that concept, they will do things a little differently, I promise. Well, listen, I'm watching my time here in California, and I know you're back there in Chicago. And so I promise you to finish up right about now. But I want to thank you, Sanjay. How do people find you?
Well, I'm happy to have anyone email me if anyone wants to contact me. That'd probably be the easiest way, and it's very easy in that sense. Sanjay is my first name, Sanjay.merchant, just like it sounds, at moody.edu. Moody is my school, so sanjay.merchant at moody.edu. And I'm always happy to receive emails and meet people that way.
And by the way, he does call people back or get back, as he did with us. And so that's how we found him. But anyway, listen, Sanjay, it's been a pleasure talking with you. I think this is a very meaningful conversation. And I wish you the very, very best back there at Moody. Proud of you. I have to say, I'm very proud of you, Dr. Merchant. You've come a long way since when I remember you many years ago. So friends, and my best to your wife, Erin, as well. She would pass that on to her. So friends, you have been listening today to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Thank you for making us part of your day. This is very meaningful to me. And until next time, be well. Bye-bye.
You have been listening to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Thank you for allowing us to be a part of your day. Tune in again next week on Apple Podcast. Rate and comment and tell a friend.